Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capital Dateline. I'm your host, Brad Swanson. We are coming to you just one block across from Florida's capital. We're outside the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association and Andrew's Grill and Bar. I'm also joined by our awesome friend, Jim Saunders, who is with the News Service of Florida. He's their executive editor. He's here to tell us about what's happening in Tallahassee and what to expect in the coming week. Jim, welcome.
Thanks.
Well, here we are, and we're going to talk about Enterprise Florida first off. That seems to be the hot issue, Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida. What's happening this week in the Capitol on that issue?
Well, it's the issue that won't go away around here. The House last week passed these bills that Governor Scott has been vehemently opposing, one of which would abolish Enterprise Florida and some other economic development programs. Another one would make substantial changes in Visit Florida, the tourism agency.
Right.
So the House passed those out on Friday of last week. And the governor has gone full-blown against the House members on it. Well, he started this before they passed the bill, but he's been holding events around the state, calling out House members by name for their support for these bills. That included this week in Tallahassee itself, holding an event at a business in Tallahassee and calling out Representative Halsey Beshears, who's a Republican from outside Tallahassee, for his support for the bill. You know, no legislator wants this in their home turf, the governor coming in and calling them out, especially when they're fellow Republicans. Right. And in fact, the governor praised a couple Tallahassee Democrats for their opposition to the bills. So there's a lot of campaigning. Also, the governor held a rally at the Capitol on Tuesday in support of Visit Florida. And had in a lot of tourism industry people. So he is putting on a full rush on these House members. The Senate, I think it should be noted, the Senate really is not moving forward with these ideas at this point. So, you know, in the end, we're going to see a lot of this play out in the budget process, I think.
I was going to say, do we expect that to be one of the big major chips going back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, House Speaker Richard Corcoran has made this his priority, a major priority of his. And when it really comes down to it, a lot of it's a funding issue. So that can play out in the budget without the Senate taking up these bills.
Right.
So I think we're going to have to watch this over the next few weeks. But the governor shows no signs of letting up in his support for these programs, and he's willing to take on members individually if he has to.
So from Enterprise Florida, that's the big oxygen stealer in the room. Let's go to an issue that affects every small and large business in the state, and that's workers' comp. That issue is under fire, if you will, being reconstructed after the Florida Supreme Court ruling. Where does that stand right now?
The House started moving forward with a bill yesterday and Tuesday regarding workers' comp. The big issue, I mean, there are a lot of issues in workers' comp. It's a very complex subject, but the big issue is attorney's fees for workers' attorneys. The Supreme Court opinion, which you referred to last year, struck down strict limits that the state had put on these attorney's fees. That played a part in a 14.5% rate increase for businesses. The House put forward a bill that would allow attorneys to be paid up to $250 an hour to represent injured workers. The business community, big business groups are fighting this tooth and nail.
Right.
It came up in committee on Tuesday, the bill did, and they debated it for a couple hours, and almost all of the debate was on attorney's fees.
Right.
So there was an amendment proposed that basically would have done away with this $250 an hour allowing attorneys to be paid $250 an hour. That amendment failed 8-7. That kind of shows how divided the House is, and a lot of legislators are on this issue. Yeah. There's a lot of pressure from both sides. Business community on one side, you got trial bar, labor unions on the other side, and this is going to be an issue that's going to play out for the rest of the session. I think they're going to have to do something, but coming to a compromise on that is going to be pretty difficult.
Well, one bill that did see some compromise, or some passage, if you will, and signage was the death penalty bill. What does that do? Where does that stand? When does that go into effect?
Yeah, the legislature moved really fast the first week, both the House and the Senate, to pass a bill that requires unanimous jury recommendations for the death penalty to be imposed. This goes back a lot of litigation over the past year, U.S. Supreme Court ruling, Florida Supreme Court ruling, but basically the death penalty has been on hold since January of 2016. So the legislature had to do something. They passed this bill. in the first week. It was the first bill that moved out of both chambers, and the governor signed it quickly.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of dockets are going to start moving now on these issues.
Well, there's still going to be a lot of litigation. There's still a lot of legal questions about imposing the death penalty. But I think this was a major hurdle they needed to get over to get the process started again. And it's evident by how quickly both chambers of the legislature and the governor moved on this, that it was something they saw as absolutely imperative during this session.
So Uber and Lyft, those bills are beginning to move, and but yet they're contentious. You've got taxi cabs on one side, the Uber companies on the other, and the legislature is literally just as divided. Where do we stand on Uber and Lyft?
Well, yesterday the Senate started moving forward with a bill that's supported by the ride-sharing industry, the Uber and Lyft, also supported by a lot of business groups in the state.
Right.
But basically the Senate, it was interesting because the Senate has blocked this bill over the past 2 years. It's been supported by the House, blocked by the Senate. But it started moving in the Senate yesterday. And by a large margin, it passed the Senate Banking and Insurance Committee.
Right.
So it looks to me like this issue might have more of a chance of passing this year than it has over the past 2 years. I think it's important to remember that former Senate President Andy Gardner was no fan of this bill. He's out of the picture at this point, and now the Senate started moving on it. So as you said, it's very contentious though. You got the ride-sharing groups on one side, but you have the taxi cabs, and local governments are upset about it on the other side. Right. Because it would take away their power to regulate these ride-sharing businesses, which are growing very fast in a lot of communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so from ride-sharing to another issue that's constitutionally generated, but we had some activity, that's the marijuana issue. Mm-hmm. We saw both some activity last year on Charlotte's Web and allowing non-THC versions of cannabis, but now we have this constitutional amendment that's getting enacted, if you will. So what's happening? Where does that stand? What's next?
Well, things have been rather slow moving forward. There's several proposals out there for carrying out this constitutional amendment. But at this point, there really hasn't been a whole lot of forward motion. I mean, but they pretty much have to do something during this session because the constitutional amendment gives the legislature the authority and the Department of Health the authority to carry out this amendment. Right. And we're talking like 500,000 patients could be eligible for medical marijuana. They've got to put a framework in place for it. But at this point, things have been really below the surface, and we have not seen a deal on this. One of the big issues is how many nurseries or they're called dispensing organizations would be authorized in the state. Right. That's been a big fight over the past couple of years of these. There's been limited medical cannabis being allowed, and that's been a big issue, is how many
vendors, suppliers, right.
nurseries, are able to get licenses to be in the business, right. Because a lot of people see a lot of money out there in this industry.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that's one where you've got a really kind of vexed legislature, and it's interesting when you have to implement a constitutional amendment. I mean, you just got to do it. So we'll stay tuned on that one. Okay, so the next one that's up is the Whiskeys and Wheaties wall. That one I've actually kind of looked like it got out to a pretty good start, but it looks like it's slowed down substantially. Where does that stand?
Well, it's moved really fast through the Senate.
Right. Tell our viewers a little bit about the issue.
Well, the issue is that there's a Prohibition-era law that prevents grocery stores from selling, and other retailers, from selling liquor in their stores. They have to open up separate facilities. Separate stores. So there's been proposals for the past few years to do away with this law. Mm-hmm. The critics of it say it's just obsolete. But it is a major lobbying issue as well. You got Target and Walmart on one side who want to do away with the law because they want to sell liquor in their stores. You got Publix and a lot of the liquor stores like ABC on the other side. So this issue has kind of got, hasn't made it very far the past couple of years. But the Senate moved fairly fast on it this session. It has been having a very difficult time getting through House committees. It got through one yesterday on an 8-7, I believe it was 8-7 vote. It was a 1-vote margin. Right. So there is a lot of lobbying going on with that issue, a lot of debate. The critics of it, one of their main arguments is that if they are allowed to sell liquor in large grocery stores, big retailers, that minors may have more access to it. That is a major argument they're making against this. So if the House wants to move this bill forward, they may try to take some steps to to try to alleviate those concerns.
Right. Well, okay. So we'll stay on a vice theme there. So from the door in the store or Whiskeys and Wheaties wall, right, to guns. Now that's been a huge issue. Senator Stubbe has been on point on what was once an omnibus bill and now is many bills, right, broken up. What's moving on guns issues and what's kind of at a standstill?
I think we're going to see the Senate pretty quickly on Wednesday pass a bill out that changes the stand your ground law.
Okay.
And this has been very important to the NRA and other gun rights groups. They've tried to get it passed last year. They were unable to, but the Senate's moving fast. And I think it probably will get through the House this year. It changes a burden of proof in stand your ground cases,
right.
Essentially shifts it from defendants to prosecutors. It's kind of a wonky legal issue, but it's important in the whole stand your ground
right.
scheme, which is a very different legal, a different legal process. So that one does look like it's going to get through. But all of these other, or most of these other big, high-profile gun bills are having a problem in the Senate.
Right.
The Judiciary Committee is very narrowly, it's split essentially, and you've got Republicans who are not supportive of bills like allowing people to carry guns on college campuses.
Or airports,
and Senator Anatary Flores, who is on that committee, is also one of the top lieutenants of the Senate president, and she opposes it. So Stubbe's having a hard time getting these sorts of bills out. Again, like you alluded to, one would allow people to carry guns at airport terminals. The campus carry is probably the highest profile, most fought about, but there are a bunch of bills out there related to gun rights, and they're having a hard time moving them through the committees. I think a lot of people thought with Stubbe, Greg Stubbe is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee,
right.
where this is getting bottled up, and a lot of people thought because he was the chairman that it might have a better chance of passing some of these, but the members of that committee are very divided on these issues.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for sharing these top issues with us. Any thoughts on the coming week of what we can look for?
Well, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more budget movement, a lot more details on the budget.
You're seeing a lot of House members filing for their hometown bills.
There are dozens of bills flying through the House right now with local project requests, those sorts of things. I think a lot of people think that this session's kind of messy. And
right.
People are wondering whether it's going to be done on time, whether it's going to have to be a special session. And I think a lot of that's going to come down to budget issues.
Right.
And so, the governor has a very different view of the budget than for instance, the House Speaker does.
Right.
And so there's going to be a lot of negotiations going to be needed over the next coming weeks on budget issues.
Yeah, I mean, relatively, the Senate is heretofore kind of quiet between the governor and the House.
And typically what happens is late March, early April, the House and the Senate each pass out their own version of the budget,
right.
kind of set it all up for negotiations, and they go forward.
Right.
So that's the process we're going to start moving into here in the third and fourth weeks of session.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. We'll continue to tune in to the News Service of Florida for great coverage, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That's all the time we have for today's episode of Capitol Dateline. Thanks for joining us. For more news and views, please check us out on our Facebook page at Capitol Dateline Online or hit us up on our Twitter feed at the FCTA. Thanks for joining.